Thanks for the download. If you enjoy what we're doing and want to help spread the word, then please take a few minutes to like this episode on Spotify, iTunes or YouTube. It'd also be great if you could subscribe to our YouTube channel or even take a few minutes to write a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or on whatever platform you're listening on, as this is the best way of bringing it to new listeners. If you want to support the pod, the best way to do this is via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes, and I'm grateful for recent contributors helping to keep the production costs to the minimum. My guest today is retired Brigadier Maer, DSO MBE, who served for 27 years in the British Army. His distinguished career included operational tours in Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq and Afghanistan. In addition to regimental duties, he held key intelligence roles within Defence Intelligence and the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre. In this episode, we explore the motivations behind his enlistment, his early training and his evolving aspirations. A central focus of our conversation is his command of 1 PWRR, the Princess of Wales Royal Regiment, during Op TELIC 4 in Iraq, a pivotal and demanding period marked by a transition from peace support operations to fierce urban combat. Matt offers deep insights into the operational challenges of TELIC 4, including the complexities of the roles of engagement, the strain on logistics, and the crucial role of communication in sustaining morale under fire. He discusses the need for adaptive leadership in modern warfare, stressing that respect and command must be continually earned, not assumed by rank. Drawing comparisons between his experiences in Northern Ireland and Iraq, he highlights the importance of rigorous, realistic training and the enduring resilience of British infantry soldiers in the face of unpredictable and high-intensity conflict. We also reflect on the legacy of the tour, the impact of gallantry awards, and the timeless leadership lessons around flexibility, trust and preparation that remain relevant to today's military professionals. Let's crack on. Matt, thank you for coming on the podcast. I've been looking forward to this discussion a lot recently.
Well, thank you very much indeed for having me.
And you joined the Army in 1986. What made you enlist, and why did you choose the Queen's Regiment?
Well, I think it originated when I was about 10 years old. My dad took me to one of those county shows down in Sussex, at which what I later worked out were actually the Royal Marines. But they carried out an attack in the arena against an enemy camp, came in by helicopter, abseiled down, lots of thunder flashes, smoke, blanks, and the bad guys died, of course, in the most artful way and on cue. And really, that was it for me, though. It's a somewhat facile answer in a way, but I just couldn't envisage anything else than wanting to be a soldier. And then I found out more about how to go about that as a career as a soldier. There's no real military background in my family. There's national service and elements of war service, but it's not. I'm not one of those officers whose great-great-great-grandfather was at the Battle of Waterloo, as it were. And I entered the process to be what's called an Army Scholar at the age of 15, which still exists as a scheme, and it provides finances to those at sixth form, or probably their parents more directly. But moreover, a place at Sandhurst. And I was successful in this, and then in getting a bursary to go to university. And so immediately after university, I then went straight to Sandhurst. Now that sounds like a very straight line, and very sort of confidently delivered. But actually, in a way, throughout that process, I was never wholly confident about my ability to first get through Sandhurst. Which I would say I endured rather than enjoyed. And secondly, to be an effective officer. And the reason is that I thought it would be an enormous challenge to be an officer on the basis of leading people and why would anyone ever do anything I asked of them, particularly when, of course, one's platoon sergeants, other NCOs, and indeed the soldiers had far greater experience. And I think for the next 27 years I served, I always firstly took leading men and women as a privilege, not a right. There are obviously legal rights to do so, but that's different. Secondly, some of that leadership has to be earned in some respect daily. And thirdly, listen to the experts and the experience. And the bottom line is that, as far as I was concerned, you may well be the most senior in the room, have that rank, right the way from you leaving Sandhurst and onwards, but it only confers on you some of the rights, those legal rights by the Army Act and such like King's regulations, to lead. And certainly the very best officers I worked with and for exhibited that great touch of being in command, certainly being in command, but leading a team, not leading by rank and ego. And just to drill down into that, because it is something that I feel quite strongly about in terms of leadership in any environment. How do you create the right atmosphere? Years after I was commissioned, I was a brigade chief of staff. And the brigadier who ran the brigade was an outstanding soldier, an outstanding leader. He came from a county infantry regiment. He had won both the DSO and the OBE in his command tour. So he got both of them in basically 2 years in command of his regiment, first in Northern Ireland and the second in Bosnia. So as you can imagine, he was at the time an absolute legend. We were on an exercise up in Catterick, I know an area you know and love well. And the brigade staff and the commanding officers, and you can well remember that, you can well sort of recognise this picture, gathered around the planning map, discussing a brigade river crossing, when from the dark recesses of the tent, a voice came out belonging to a newly commissioned officer from the Royal Artillery. And he spoke up in this sort of august company and politely but firmly told the brigadier that while he could provide the air defence, which was what his role was, on 2 of the crossings, the third one, not so much, and it was outside the umbrella. Now, on the one hand, of course, what your listeners might say, well, that's what the lieutenant was there for. He was the expert. And, of course, professionally, he was doing the right thing. But on the other hand, he was by far the most junior rank in that august company, as I say. And it was only an exercise. Look, it was a map exercise up in Catterick. It would have been a debrief point on the pages of the post-exercise report. But, and he could have therefore not shown that moral courage. But what struck me was that he did so as an individual, but moreover, that legendary brigade commander, actually what he'd done is created that leadership atmosphere that enabled that young officer to speak up without fear, to say that thing professionally, knowing that he would be listened to. And that just struck me as that's commanding and leading, but putting your ego and your rank outside the tent, as it were. Anyway, to go back to your question, which I think you asked about 4 weeks ago, for your leaders, having decided the army, it was always going to be the infantry. It was, to me, the epitome of that thing of being a soldier. And from that step, the Queen's Regiment was logical. It was my local infantry regiment, being formed in 1969 from a collection of county regiments. Royal Sussex Regiment, very much my home area. The Buffs, East Kent, Royal West Kents, East and West Surrey Regiment, and the Middlesex Regiment. And then in 1992, the Queen's Regiment in turn amalgamated with the Royal Hampshire Regiment in order to collect the set, as it were, of infantry coverage in the southeast of England. And it is England's oldest and senior infantry regiment of the line. But to me, actually, although I said that was a logical step, I had a fantastic opportunity because I've been sponsored through school and university by the Army, and I was going to Sandhurst. That place had already been awarded to me and was awaiting me to actually go out and see other parts of the Army, Royal Artillery, Royal Engineers, REME, and others. And the Queen's Regiment itself, actually in Germany at the time. And I visited them. I went adventure training, on exercise, and I met the officers and the soldiers. And I just felt that I'd sort of come home, actually. it cemented in my mind that I wanted to lead the soldiers of that regiment. I wanted to be one of their officers. I suppose in the youth slang of today, I had found my people. But anyway, I certainly never regretted that choice for 1 second. Absolutely loved every moment of service with the regiment.
I think it's interesting when we're discussing there about officers coming into regiments, because I've been a troop sergeant, I was a battery sergeant major, and I was a regimental sergeant major. And I think the first appointment when a young lieutenant comes in, if he gets a good or a bad sergeant that he works with, that can really set the conditions, good or for bad, for the rest of his career. And then as you get to battery sergeant major, or company sergeant major in your case, and RSM, the relationship between those two, the senior non-commissioned officer and the officer, are crucial and can make or break a regiment or a battery or a company, can't they?
Absolutely. And actually, when I was I found a particular company as a company commander, and I happened to be in Bosnia at the time. One might think that as a company commander, your relationship to your other officers would be the closest one you have. And it certainly wasn't a distant one. But what I found was the closest personal professional relationship I had was with my company sergeant major, because there is a certain element of your ages are probably the same. Certainly your experience is the same. You've probably done round about the same length of service in the regiment. And so actually, not just professionally, but when you're sort of, going off for a brew, go to the sort of the NAFI or whatever for a coffee on operations or such like, then actually you're the company sergeant major, I found, and you as a company commander, had a really, really close relationship. And certainly also, most importantly, between the two of you, you set the tone in that organization. And as you say, same if you become a commanding officer and the regimental sergeant major, between the two of you, you set the tone, the culture, the ethos of that regiment, and you have to be in lockstep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, it takes moral courage both ways. In each of those positions, it takes moral courage for the non-commissioned officer to turn around and go, "Sir, have you really thought about this?" And
absolutely.
And if that officer thinks, "No, actually, I am on the right track here," it takes equally for them to turn around and say, "Actually, Sergeant Major, Sergeant, no, I'm sticking to my decision, but I've listened to you."
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. You've got to have an open and honest conversation, because you're right. Your senior NCO may say to you, your company sergeant may say, "Boss, I'm not sure about this one." And equally, you've got to be open to that. Oh, okay. Tell me what I should be doing, sort of thing, or why not? But equally, you might turn around and say, "Oh, yeah, no, sorry, Sergeant Major. What I didn't explain, slightly bigger picture, is X, Y, and Z." Oh, okay. And you've got to have that conversation. And I find it's really interesting. I think it's so misunderstood in civilian life about the army, is almost because there's the army, there's this slight pantomime of saluting and sir and ma'am and all that, which is necessary. It's absolutely necessary. But it can come across as autonomous, autonomy, as it were. You will do this. There is rank, and no one talks back or anything like that. Absolutely not true, as you know. You have some very professional, frank exchanges. But, and this is underlined 15 times, it goes back to my example, the guy or girl at the top has to set that atmosphere where that can take place. And if you don't set that atmosphere, do you know what? This week I had a consultant in my current job telling me that the term for this was psychological safe space. Who knew? Yeah, I know. Don't even. But I thought, I thought back to that dripping tents in Catterick training area. I thought, oh, was that a psychological safe space? Sure felt like a dripping number 9. But anyway, but this is it. People have got to have this sense that, I can speak up from the back of it. I don't know. Actually, this atmosphere in here, the culture, the tone, call it what you will, is, boss, just one thing, can't cover the third bridge. Okay, come here, let's talk about it, It's so vital.
Yeah, absolutely. So, can you give us an overview of your career up to taking command of one PWRR?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I'm somewhat embarrassed that I'm possibly the most conventional soldier to have on your excellent unconventional soldier podcast. In that, unlike many of they really have been genuinely great guests. So I was never in the special forces, commandos, airborne forces. And to be clear, I don't think I would have made it through those rigorous selection processes. And to be equally clear, that is not false modesty. I am not now, nor ever have been, nor ever will be, one of those in the army or out the army who says, "Oh yeah, of course I would have done P Company, but I had to put the cat out," or yeah, I was going down Hereford, but X, Y, and Z. I would have gone to Lympstone, but I don't look good in a dress. I had to get that one in. Sorry, guys. No, look, these special and specialised elements have massive strengths in the individuals within them. They have exacting standards physically and mentally, and they have a collective spirit that I've admired and on a number of occasions had the privilege of working alongside. But for me, no, I never bothered the DS at a checkpoint in Brecon, and my sleeves remained clear of any specialist badges. So rather, I had a very green army career, as it's sometimes referred to. Platoon commander in Canada and Northern Ireland, captain instructor at the platoon sergeant's battle course at Brecon, which is great fun. Perhaps less so for those of going through it, but I enjoyed it. Adjutants in Northern Ireland twice, so company commander in Bosnia, brigade chief of staff in Bosnia. I actually had 2 Christmases back to back in Banja Luka Metal Factory. You've won the golden ticket in life.
Must have done something terrible.
Well, I was there as brigade chief, so they went back as the company commander. I could see my Corrimec on Christmas Day from my Corrimec. I then worked in headquarters army as a chief of staff, field army, PGHQ, and with the Americans in Central Command. The second string to my bow was that great contradiction, military intelligence, with roles in Northern Ireland twice, defence intelligence in the MOD twice, as well as in the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, which was joint service, but actually the joint bit refers to the 3 government intelligence agencies that are there, as well as all the other government departments. So, yeah, no, I was very much a conventional soldier, Green Army in operations.
It's interesting. The main focus for a lot of civilians, whether it's podcasts, TV programs, is on airborne and commando forces. And that airborne and commando ethos is quite easily identified by the berries, the selection process they do. But I think what's forgotten is the ethos of a good county line regiment or battalion. And I've worked with airborne forces, commando forces, and line infantry. And the good line infantry battalions have a heritage and pride and often family connections that have more or less build the same type of ethos as you would see in a commando or a parachute regiment. Was that a fair comment from your experience?
Yeah, I think it's same but different. The airborne and commando forces obviously gather their esprit de corps, which is strong, through their selection process, and from their history. Although obviously for the parachute regiment, that's not so deep; it's more habits. But the county.
You're going to get some hate on that.
You know that, don't you? You know that. Hey, look, what's the point of doing this unless you're going to have a bit of bants, as it were? But yes, I'm locking my door and windows tonight. But but equally, the other regiments, as it were, the county regiments and indeed the guards, they're drawing on a history to go back 300 years, as you say, a family connections very, very often, and a sense of professionalism that is just as strong. And the one thing I would say is, of course, I understand why, and I do genuinely understand why that the Commando Selection and P Company makes a great, great documentary. Not is it sort of exciting, but in television and media terms, it has that thing of the air of jeopardy. Will they make it? Will Smith make it? Or will Jones not make it? Etc. Etc. But of course, and this is not to detract from the fantastic work those folk do, but if you were to take out the Falklands War in the arc of history for those forces, a lot of them, the airborne and commando forces, for a lot of the time, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s were on the operational tour plot for Northern Ireland as infantry alongside, regiments like the Devon and Dorset, Stafford's, Cheshire's, Queen's Regiment. So that's not, as I say, to detract what it takes to get in there, or indeed joking apart their great history and what they've done. But yeah, the difference is not that great when you come down to it on the ground, in my professional opinion. And you have good and bad in both, would be my observation.
And that wasn't just some random question, because it will actually tie into a further discussion we're going to have, but that's why I wanted to bring it up at this point, just sort of set the conditions. Operation TELIC in Iraq has largely been overshadowed by Operation Herrick in Afghanistan, and some of the fighting was as hard as anything on Herrick in Iraq. In addition, it could be argued that TELIC 4, which your battalion deployed on, marked a turning point in British operations, falling somewhere between Northern Ireland and warfighting. This shift also highlighted the fact that traditional county line infantry could fight such campaigns in austere environments previously seen since the Falklands as generally the preserve of airborne or commando units. Just what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to a great extent. Line infantry, as it's called, the county regiments, the Queen's Regiment, I mentioned Stafford's, Royal Welsh Fusiliers, I'll come on to, etc., etc. In Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Kosovo, largely, had a role of provided what was described as framework operations, in quotations, certainly in Northern Ireland, conducting patrols, showing a presence, gaining very low-level intelligence and information, deterring and disrupting attacks if you were fortunate, and supporting the local police or such like. And certainly in Northern Ireland, the police, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, had what was called at the time primacy. That was the official term, police primacy, which meant, quite rightly, because it was in the United Kingdom, they set the security agenda at the strategic, operational, and certainly at the tactical level. So, for example, I first went to Northern Ireland late 1980s, first tours into Belfast, and we very largely patrolled with a member of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. Indeed, we were generally not allowed to patrol without one of them alongside us. And while in the city there were military-only bases, such as North Howe Street Mill, where I was on the Falls Road, we tended only to sort of sleep and operate out of there, actually spending our days in RUC stations, picking up and dropping off the coppers, escorting them on their duties, be that on foot or in vehicle. Now, in the rural areas, there were military-only observation towers and vehicle checkpoints, again, staffed and manned by the Green Army. But even there would be RUC present at times. Now, that was sort of routine, framework operations, support to the police. But within that, if there are any sort of sexy operations taking place, if I can put it that way, by specialist units of the army, and there are a lot, particularly in Northern Ireland, as you'll remember, 14 INT, the FRU, Force Research Unit, Northern Ireland Surveillance Section, all these specialised units, particular about Northern Ireland, or indeed the Army's Special Forces, the SAS or SBS. If they were operating in an area, then generally that area was red boxed. In other words, on the map in the ops room would come up a Chinograph pen or box the area out for a certain period of time, if appropriate. And the Green Army, us, were not allowed to enter. So as you say, the line infantry units provided that framework around which others operated. Now, to go to Iraq and Afghanistan, all those assumptions changed. All of that changed. Firstly, there was no police force or army at the start. So there was no, there was no Royal Ulster Constabulary. There was no Ulster Defence Regiment, which worked very closely with us, or us with them, I should put more correctly, in Northern Ireland. They didn't exist. And secondly, the distances and the areas to be covered just increased dramatically per head of troop, as it were. So you've touched on already one PWRR battle group, TELIC 4. that battle group that I had the privilege of commanding had an area of operations the size of Northern Ireland itself. So for 30 years, the British Army had 3 brigade-sized units supported by the Ulster Defence Regiment, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and then all those divisional capabilities I've mentioned, the specialist units and the special forces. Actually, Northern Ireland was quite a crowded battle space when you look back on it. Strong police, strong army units, wide and deep support. By contrast, we turned up in Iraq. We were as far from our brigade headquarters as Norwich is from London, along one heavily interdicted road. So no functioning police force, no real government structure, heavily armed and increasingly hostile population. So we, as were to happen in Afghanistan, had platoons a long way from help, across a big area and at high risk. Now, normally, on the old model, if you needed to put small groups of determined men at reach, as the expression is, in high-risk areas, and training indigenous forces, which we were doing in those areas, then it would be done by special forces. That was a special forces or a special forces task because of the distance, the reach, the risk, and the role. We were doing it with 18-year-olds from Bermondsey, from a county line regiment. Now, I think before I make any more, fill up your comment section with any more hate mail for me. I know that there are going to be a lot of old Northern Ireland veterans out there walking the dog on the train now, shouting about their time in OPs or bases on the Northern Ireland border and those VCPs. And they were small bands of determined men on their own. I get that. I hear it. I was there a number of times. And I don't belittle that situation, or indeed with the platoon houses in Bosnia, which again, I had in my company. But I did all that and then went to Iraq. And all I can say is the risks were different. One of our company bases in Iraq, one of my company bases in Iraq, hit by 45 attacks in one day, including mortar fire. So as I say, not to discredit, not to belittle those who did their time in Northern Ireland, Bosnia, and my regiment, the Queen's Regiment, did more tours in Northern Ireland than any other infantry regiment. So I hear it, stop shouting at the dog. Just trust me, it's different. It's just different. So again, a short answer is yes. The line and county infantry regiments found themselves at distance in high-risk areas doing those high-risk tasks, which hitherto had not necessarily fallen their way in that manner.
Yeah, and the other thing you had in Northern Ireland was decent comms, generally speaking.
Yes.
And Alamara and that route up to Alamara from Basra. I mean, I remember when I got attached to the battle group and we're doing one of our first convoy moves and we're looking at the comms plan, and you had to have all the VHF frequencies, you had a sat phone, and then the last comms resort was a mobile phone that you would have to call MOD in London to patch you through to Alamara Ops Room. And as an old Northern Ireland hand, I was looking at this going, Jesus Christ.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. So we took, Klansmen, the then waning radio kit anyway. I mean, I say we, the British Army, which was designed for Northwest Europe. And again, in a dense battle space, into a desert in the summer at range, and it didn't work. So, a lot of us found ourselves phoning that charming lady in the Ministry of Defence and saying, "Hate to bother you, if you wouldn't mind just sort of putting your knitting down." I'm being rude, but but we got a bit of incoming fire here, and if you could patch me through to the ops, it'd be terribly kind of you. Yeah, farcical, wasn't it? Yeah.
So what pre-deployment training did the battalion carry out?
Oh, well, whatever it was that was about Iraq, I can't remember much of it. I mean, to be honest with you, the only thing I can remember, we got a bit of sort of, really poor language training, which came in of no use whatsoever. And what we faced was not covered at all in the briefings of the forces that we faced. So we went, believe it or not, we went down to Lyddon Hythe and did ranges down there, and we went on Salisbury Plain. And I think that's all I can say about it, really. but it sort of didn't matter in some ways, because during our tour, we reached in to two training regimes, which will be familiar to your listeners if they served in the military at any stage. But they were deep in the DNA of the British Army. And the first of that was BATUS. For those who may be unaware, BATUS stands, because the Army loves an abbreviation, doesn't it? It stands for British Army Training Unit Suffield. And now, knowing that, you'll know further forward in what on earth BATUS is. But it's basically 1,000 square miles of nothing but prairie in Canada. And it will be fondly remembered by some of your listeners, or not fondly remembered by some of your listeners, particularly our Armoured Corps brethren. But for normal people, if you think of Salisbury Plain on steroids, you've got an idea of what BATUS was like. Say 1,000 square miles of nothing. It was actually set up in 1972. And the training area before that the British Army was using, and I love this fact, boring puff fact, was in Libya.
I never knew that.
I know. It's sort of, before BATUS was Libya. But that was the armoured training area for the British Army. But in 1972, and there's got to be a second army, a colonel called Gaddafi kicked the British Army out. So I love it when a colonel says go away. So the British Army relocated to BATUS on the colonel's word. And really, it's over half a century later, and for the last 50 years, that's where the British Army carries out its heavy training. So that's tanks, armoured vehicles, artillery, attack helicopters, blah blah blah. It's a huge area, large scale manoeuvres. So I think Wellington was alleged once to have said Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. I think the Falklands could be said to have been won on the training area of Sennybridge. Then it could equally be said the two Gulf Wars were won on the prairie of Alberta. And one PWRR, without me at the helm, but had completed a BATUS in the summer before going to Iraq. So the battle group staff, the company commanders, all the teams, the crews were absolutely on the top line for that fast-thinking, fast-moving warfighting, all arms, everything from slick radio procedure through to slick orders, turret drills, etc. And that was going to pay off during our tour. Secondly, the second training regime at the other end of the spectrum, as it were, was going back to Northern Ireland training and experience, frankly, because when we weren't rocking the heavy metal stuff, we were patrolling to show presence, reassure the population. And I think it's not just that. It was just there's something about the British Army's experience in Northern Ireland for nearly 30 years is that just innately understood at all ranks was that you're there to win over the population. I went out there with a really trite expression across the battalion, which was smile, shoot, smile. So in other words, you're friendly, you're open, you're engaging with the civilian population. If they shoot at you, you shoot back and you win. But then you smile. You revert back to, the thing. Actually, in my first contact, which was quite a brisk afternoon, we'd broken out of this contact area, got away from the killing area we were in, got into a ditch, of course, reorganised. The guys are filling their magazines back up. And one of the radio operators looked at me and just looked at me deadpan in the face and said, "So, can we smile now, sir?" Which I thought,
good squaddy humour.
Great squaddy humour. I thought, hey, but at least you listened to what I said. But yeah, so that it was that balance. It was these true big training evolutions that gave us the ability to go from that sort of low-level counterinsurgency up to full war fighting and back again. And sometimes we were genuinely literally doing that within 24 hours, or even, because it was such a big area, doing it simultaneously, but in different parts of the area. So yeah, BATUS and Northern Ireland, rather than any pre-deployment training, is what we relied upon.
And I take it you must have quite a good core of senior NCOs and the older officers that had that vast experience from Northern Ireland, to take it.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, I had that. And also, the other thing was that was Bosnia, which is often forgotten. But that was sort of, it was almost there was a lot of fighting at the start, I know, but that was sort of like Northern Ireland 2.0 in a way. And indeed to an extent with Kosovo. So all of which have been, the regiment have been a lot. So deeply steeped in that experience of civilian populations, capacity building, government building, development in what is fundamentally a risky environment, though.
The battalion's area of operations was Maysan province, with a main base in Camp Abu Naji, close to the city of Alamara. And Alamara had a population round about 500,000. In the book Dusty Warriors by Richard Holmes, you describe Maysan as an independent, insular, introspective, violent province before, during, and after Saddam's time. Can you describe the operational environment in Alamara when 1 PWRR arrived in 2004, and what were your initial objectives and expectations?
Well, first of all, that description is true, but it's put much more politely in Dusty Warriors than what I genuinely. A general came to visit. Genuinely, this is absolutely true. And I said, look, I basically said, look, we're as far from Basra as London is from Norwich. And like much of Norfolk, this area is marshy, introspective, behind the rest of the nation, truculent and heavily armed. And then there was a beat and he said, my family comes from Norfolk. Seriously. No, look, for any of you who come from Norfolk, my apologies. I hadn't had much sleep at the time. We'll move on. But yeah, no, genuinely, that happened. I thought, oh my goodness, that didn't start well. But yeah, look, Maysan province itself was the home of what was known as the Marsh Arabs. Very different people, very different area to the modern Iraq. They've been persecuted by Saddam Hussein badly. Now, he had attempted to drain those marshes and so ruin their livelihoods. And the other key factor, though, is bordered by Iran. It was bordered by Iran, and it was an extremely porous border. I mean, I think some of your old team have been up on that border in the very, very early days and reported back. And let me just say, none of that information got to us. You know, talking about pre-deployment, none of that information got to us about that Iranian border. And yeah, that was wrong. And that was wrong because that had a massive influence on what was happening to us. Because a lot of the people there look more to the east in Iran than they did to west in Baghdad. And of course, Iran strategically was very much welcoming the opportunity to cause the West casualties and embarrassment in Iraq. I mean, it's the sort of the person, the group that the Iranians hated the most had arrived on their doorstep. So hello. We'll have a go at this, and as I say, that border was not. They
supplied a lot of the technology and munitions like EFPs, explosive form projectiles that took such a toll on the vehicles.
And also undoubtedly were sending people over to lead and organise and coalesce the attack. But also the area, interestingly, had never been liberated by coalition forces. Basically, what happened in the Second Gulf War, TELIC 1, as it were, Saddam's army just fled as soon as the writing was on the wall. And so local tribes, local groups, local playmakers had taken over in that vacuum before the first coalition troops arrived in the form of the Royal Irish Regiment. And this meant the whole of the history, the culture, the way the economy worked, its geopolitical location, its sociology, meant that this was a group of people who were very independent-minded. They felt they controlled their own destiny and were pretty much distrustful of outsiders. And the other thing, going back to your question about pre-deployment training, no one mentioned to us was that they were aligned to a particularly Shia Muslim sect led by an individual called Muqtada al-Sadr, the Mahdi. And so the Mahdi army were the main antagonists against us. Now, we turned up thinking the Mahdi army were a bunch of Geordies. We're the Mahdi army, lad. But, we never heard of the Mahdi army, but they came to influence us heavily. Now, so that was sort of what we were getting into anyway. It wasn't slick. It wasn't Basra. It wasn't sophisticated. It was rural, marsh, etc. Then against that background, I think what happened was, if I get it right, what was called the Provisional Coalition Authority, which is effectively the government in Baghdad who are running Iraq in lieu of any indigenous government, they closed down an Al-Sada newspaper and made some arrests. And this was in another province, not even in the British area, some way away. And then it just all kicked off ahead of our arrival. And I remember standing in Bryce Norton with the guys, and the television screens were showing in Bryce explosions and vehicles burning, etc., etc. So as we came in to take over from the 1st Battalion Light Infantry, who were just, I just want to say, were great, truly, truly outstanding organisation. There'd already been 3 weeks of sort of heavy contact, rocketing and mortaring. And so, we came into that, southern Iraq in flames by a bunch of people we'd never heard of before. So, no plans for vice contact with the enemy. And we therefore had to swivel from that peace support, development, capacity building stance into one of war fighting. And we knew light infantry gave us a clue that, they'd done very, very well, that we might not be on the right track of our training. When, the first day I had in command, I went up into Alamara. Our main base was slightly outside, about 7 k's outside, to visit the government in a place which became well known, but it was CIMIC House, another military abbreviation, CIMIC, which is Civilian Military Cooperation House. I went up there, and then a patrol from our support company was engaged in an ambush and were effectively pinned down. I worked out that actually my group, my radio operators, my close protection team, and my regimental sergeant major in our 3 Land Rovers were the closest to assist. Now, don't do this at home, kids, because the CO shouldn't really do this, but, I did it only because we were the closest. So we mounted up, we grabbed the RSM, and the RSM, odd things, he was actually getting his hair cut by a locally employed civilian in the base. He hadn't had his time to have his hair cut during the sort of range time. So we arrived, we went, oh, great, the boss is off chin wagging, the RSM went, I'm going to get my hair cut. When the runner came up and said, sir, we're going. So he stuck his helmet on. It wasn't until that evening that he took his helmet off and he was, shaved head. But anyway, which was just brilliant. But anyway, so we headed out down to the ambush location. We're about 600, 800 meters away. And we drove down, and the River Tigris was on our right. For those of you familiar with, anyone familiar with London, it was a bit like the embankment with the big river on our right-hand side. And I became aware that there were a lot of blokes, a lot of men dressed entirely in black who seemed to be firing a lot of AK-47s at us. And I know it sounds weird, but despite my military service, I remember clearly thinking, that's a bit odd. I know people are going to say, duh, but honestly, it was a bit dislocating, this. But then we went under a road overpass, and an RPG-7, that's a rocket-propelled grenade, was fired at us. And I thought, right, okay, all right, this is for real. We were actually going at such speed at this time that we went through the ambush site and out the other side. And I looked out the vehicle, and I saw the support company troops on the side of the road where they had taken cover. They were somewhat astonished to see the commanding officer arrive and then disappear at speed. So I then had to actually get on the net to my team and say, right, we're going back in. Little bit of a moment of leadership. But anyway, we spun around, we went back in. And then basically for that afternoon, for a period of time, we formed all round defence from back gardens and things like that. And until a very hastily formed group of warrior armoured vehicles from the regiment in the city for the first time, never been there, map reading their way. got us out. One of them was that was led by an individual called Private Bahari, who no one had heard of at that time, but he was one of the drivers. But anyway, so I'd lost one of my Land Rovers that was RPG'd during the afternoon, and one of my close protection team was wounded. But hey, look, he later married a nurse who looked after him at Selly, so he can thank me later. But the point is that was literally our first afternoon. And, you know that you can imagine I walked back into the ops room. The commanding officer's been in an ambush, fighting. We've had to go in, warriors. I walked back into the ops room, and there was just this sense of, okay, this is going to be different. And that little is a little firefight, really. But that set the tone that afternoon for much more of what was to come, and worse over the next 26 weeks. Yeah,
it's interesting because what you described there is not. It's that dislocation of expectation that you said when you saw the men in black with AKs, but it's also a dislocation of expectation for the ops room, for the soldiers in the regiment. It's not what you expect the commanding officer's rover group to get brassed up within the first few days of arrival.
No.
How did that affect your mindset then, that had happened so early on?
Oh, I was massively pleased. Sorry to anyone that was in my rover group and is going to just take this the wrong way. Why I say massively pleased, because it set a tone, and it was, as you're absolutely right. If that, first of all, that sort of ambush, then breaking out of ambush using warrior, that was different to what we'd have experienced in any of our soldiering, that just first afternoon. But actually, as a commanding officer, I could sort of look people in the eye, and they could look me in the eye. And, we could then get through, and it wasn't the only time that it happened to me, but it was quite nice in a really weird way to get the first goal in yourself for the team. I mean, I think some of your listeners that served will understand that. Some people might think it's a bit weird. And I want to make it very, 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 very clear. I didn't go down that road with that objective in mind. It literally, we were just the closest. But yeah, it was, in many ways, it was good because everyone sat up and thought, this is not going to be our 30th tour of Northern Ireland, because the regiment had done 29 up to that point. This is going to be different. And yeah, it set the agenda, really.
I suppose as well, on that leadership perspective, I think you might have used a term earlier that, you and the RSM could look the guys in the eye. When they've come in from a hard contact and there's been casualties, it's not just platitudes. You've been there. You can look them in the eye and say, right, we're going to sort this out. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And they can look at you and you've got some authority, not just authority of your rank, but authority of having been in those situations yourself.
Correct. And my opening remarks is leadership is not a right, it's a privilege. And inadvertently, perhaps I'd earned the privilege to lead them through the next 6 months from that activity in that afternoon. As I say, didn't look for it. Wouldn't particularly want to have gone through it again, although I did. But you never chase a bus or a firefight. There will be another one along. But So yeah, it's probably quite a strange answer. If someone was out walking the dog, I hope they sort of, what were your feelings on that? And I said, I thought it was really welcomed it, but it did. It set that tone and set myself, the RSM, and the others up in that. Okay, they've done it. That's fine. And as you say, when they came in off the ground, there was that empathy and understanding on both sides.
And as commanding officer, how did you approach leading a battalion engaged in intense urban combat while balancing the broader political sensitivities of the mission?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because I think we all knew, again, due to Northern Ireland and the Balkans experience, that the mission was not to fight a war. However much that impinged upon it. Rather, we were there to train the nascent Iraqi police and army support elections, and help with development. But evidently to do so, we first had to gain that secure environment, which is spoken about a lot in military terms. It's spoken about a lot later on in Afghanistan, where those good things could happen. And in fact, I remember I was interviewed. Odd things happen to you sometimes when you go on these tours, as you know. And I actually was interviewed by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. I didn't realise afterwards he was a really nice guy, but I didn't realise he was that laudable. And he sat down and chatted. We chatted for some time. And I said that sometimes, my quote was, sometimes you have to fight for peace. Well, when he published in America, this led to what can only describe as a dynamic conversation in the comments section of his newspaper. Because, of course, it sounds utterly contradictory. You're fighting for peace. I mean, you can imagine the reaction certain people took to that. But it's true. Until the level of violence against those wanting to deliver the new Iraq could be dissipated, then all those other lines of activity couldn't happen. And we, the coalition forces, were the only ones that could gain that peaceful space. And so, although it's possibly remembered TELIC 4 as being a very kinetic tour and all that sort of stuff, and unjustifiably, there was an awful lot of going on the political side. And I spent personally a very significant part of my time dealing with the local politicians, the tribal leaders, the police chief, who was a superb guy, and others, with the help of our policy advisor, who was a US State Department lady who was brilliant, between us to try on a one-to-one basis daily to orchestrate movement in this area. And actually, I'm going to say this because it needs saying, the military planning and the operations in support of that scheme were largely, delivered very largely by the battle group chief of staff and the ops officer and the ops team in support of this. And as a reflection of this is that when I was halfway through my R&R, one of the soldiers in the regiment was killed at Simic House. And I called the brigade commander from where I was in R&R, and that was actually in the Brecon Beacons. Yeah.
Your partner must have been dead.
I know. She's well, yeah. But yeah, you did hear that right. I went to the Brecon Beacons on my R&R. Yeah, I know. Moving on. But he said he would allow me back only on two conditions. One was that I would complete my R&R, which I did. Because it almost became a matter of pride, as it were, that we would see through, as well as all the evident benefits and necessity to do that. But it was sort of a professional pride. But more importantly, because I was the individual who, literally on my mobile phone, had all the political contacts and connections to put that piece of the puzzle in, which the Battle Group 2IC and the staff didn't particularly have those relationships, and it needed both of us, left and right hand, to work this issue through. So, as I say, it in answer to your question, we were doing, as you say, intense urban operations, but in order to get the mission back on track, which was capacity development for the Iraqi security forces, and development and politics and elections and that sort of life, yeah.
And actually, there's quite a few echoes again there with Northern Ireland, isn't there? It's a bit, chicken and egg. You can't have a political, peaceful solution without a peaceful security environment.
100%, and again in Bosnia. When I was the divisional chief of staff in Bosnia, the strategy was these pillars were about development and reconstruction and return of refugees and displaced people, except all these were civil activities. And really, the military piece was the provision of a safe and secure environment. I mean, I think that was pretty much the only thing that the military were solely dedicated to. I mean, they got involved in everything else, But the military piece was a safe and secure environment. And until you've got that, the other bits cannot operate.
I think one of the things the army and the politicians forgot, though, was there's a lot of strengths with the army at the tactical level, and we've already discussed the soldiers' experience, and they knew what to do in the vein of Northern Ireland. But I think what was forgotten was that strategic patience, there was none of that really in Iraq. They just wanted in and out. The importance of intelligence, again, you've alluded to the intelligence gaps.
Yeah.
But police primacy was the key to Northern Ireland, and you couldn't have police primacy in Iraq. So I think sometimes when they talk about, oh, the Brits are good at this Northern Ireland thing, we'll move that experience over here, that strategic stuff was just forgotten about.
Yeah, and funnily enough, I went and worked in Headquarters Central Command amongst the US forces, and after this, and we were talking about the British military experience compared to the US military experience through history. And and I didn't raise it, and they said you guys had a great success, in Northern Ireland, but gee, it took you 30 years, and they weren't saying that as a criticism, because they were taught that it was a success in Northern Ireland, but they said no one finishes the sentence in their war schools, but it took 30 years, and that's absolutely right. And actually, when we were in Iraq, there were some even more problematic issues in that, as you know, the Iraq invasion was contentious politically. And so the Department for International Development, and I can't remember the lady who ran it, was not exactly forthcoming in support. And I said that my policy advisor, what didn't come from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, where one would expect them to come from in terms of the provincial one. I had a battle group individual who was very good, but it came from the US State Department. And the third example I give is whenever we delivered some form of development and aid, and we did this in the final third, air conditioning units to hospitals, clinics, et cetera, et cetera. I said, well, look, can we at least put a Union Jack up? Because as you know, where the US go, they go deliver, donated by the people of America, USAID, and it's on there. And they said, absolutely not. Absolutely, you can't do that. We put a new bridge in. No, you can't say that's from the people of Britain. That is smacks of colonization, which I sort of get the point, but it's very difficult to convince people that don't like you what good you're doing for them if you don't sort of brand your output. It was a really complicated political situation behind us, as well as, frankly, the overarching idea that when the Mahdi army first rose up, that was quite politically inconvenient. The political narrative, of course, was that we would go into Iraq, we'd find those weapons of mass destruction. The Iraqi people would be throwing roses on the front decks of the tanks. We'd slip into berries, and it would become a shining beacon of democracy and love for the Gulf. It didn't quite work out that way, so what was happening to us was politically a tad inconvenient back in Whitehall, and I think it took them a long time to reconcile their thinking to the fact this is not just a speed bump. It is the way it's going to be from now on in. It's the start of it setting a pattern of it getting worse. Not just where we were, Basra, Fallujah, and all the other places that are now so infamously known.
Yeah. We've sort of touched on training already, sort of generic British Army training, like of what you did in Battis. But I'd just like to expand a little bit on how well did British Army training and doctrine prepare your troops for the type of fighting they encountered in Iraq, especially the close quarters, urban, insurgent style of warfare?
Yeah, as I say, we sort of talked about it a little bit earlier. I think the British Army going into Iraq was a fantastic jack of all trades. Northern Ireland, we've spoken about the Cold War, the big heavy metal moving. Bosnia, I think, gets overlooked as its assistance in this. so that we had this golf bag of doctrine and training and experience that we could pull out the best instrument at the time. And I think that possibly made us unique as an army, that ability to do it. And I can just give you a real life example. Within the battle group, I had the great fun of having a squadron of the Queen's Royal Lancers with us. And I don't normally, name people, but their squadron leader was the most inappropriately named individual in the British Army, Major Coward, which was almost a joke because, a man who's the most inappropriate surname. But anyway, James and his guys. Now, they were originally deployed with a task of training the Iraqis. And they were equipped in Land Rovers to do so because, as I say, that was what was going to happen, right? But obviously, in the intensity of operations, very early increased on afternoon one, and then got worse. And our brigade headquarters found a squadron of Challenger tanks on the docks. Now we've all been in that position, haven't we? You turn around and there you go. Suddenly, it's something out of Delta, isn't it? Oh, oi, mate, do you want some second-hand tanks? Only slightly scratched. But anyway, the brigade headquarters are very, very good. And they grabbed these and they moved them up to us in Maysan and handed them over to the Lancers. And I tell you, I have never seen such a happy bunch of soldiers. When the Lancers could dump their role largely, and their Land Rovers certainly, and I swear they hugged those Challengers. And then, of course, they used it to great effect with a normal cavalry aplomb and style in Anamara, where their arrival in 70 tons of armour tended to end any disagreement that was going on. But their ability to do that, and the battle group's ability to do it, I think was because the doctrine, the experience, the training had been so wide-ranging. And, I just reflect that the 2nd Battalion of the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment, which in turn went to Iraq, it went to Afghanistan as infantry. It doesn't exist any longer. It's gone. It's now, by title, allegedly, 2 Rangers. And that's a substitution of 550 combat infantrymen with a range of operations under its belt for about 150 soldiers whose mission is to train indigenous forces. Full stop. Now, I don't want to be one of those retired officers, but the facts are you've just lost 400 combat infantrymen, and from those infantrymen who went from Batus, Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Belize, etc., 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 and therefore, by the time, as you said earlier, the warrant officers and sergeants mess and the company commanders and commanding officers had that golf bag of experience, you have 150 soldiers who train indigenous forces. Well, I mean, one of the things I didn't say in my background is that as a captain, I deployed from Germany to train the Mozambican army in Zimbabwe back in the day for 6 months. We did it in Afghanistan. Obviously, people did it in Afghanistan. They did it in Iraq, that sort of thing. That's it. We've lost 400. Well, more than, because it's under 5 infantry battalions. We've lost that. We've lost 5 times 400 combat infantrymen for a single task,
which used to be called British Army training teams, BAT teams.
Correct. And I was in BAT Zimbabwe, and they were all over. And you just did that. It was just expected that senior NCOs and officers, around about captain onwards, could just pack up their bag from Germany, Tidworth, wherever, and go and train and grow and develop indigenous forces overseas. It was just what you did.
I know I'm very ignorant and I've been out, and no doubt people will correct me, but I know as well with the Rangers, they're supposed to be more in line as well with what the omelette teams were in Afghanistan, from what I can gather. But as we have said countless times in this podcast with numerous guests, if you always train at the highest level, for example, armoured warfare, it's easy to step down 3 or 4 places. But if you only train at a light infantry level, you can't just flip to 3 or 4 steps up. It's just never going to happen.
Yeah. and you're right, and undoubtedly, again, adding to the list of people that I now must avoid is anyone in the Rangers who I don't understand it. I'm a retired old codger, let's use that word, blah, 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 blah. But the fact is, folks, we've just lost 400. Well, I can't work out 5 times 400. That's why I'm in the infantry. Combat infantrymen. And, Stalin said quantity has a quality all of its own. And you look at what's happening in Ukraine. You look at what we managed to do in the First and Second Gulf War. Go back to, by the way, to Northern Ireland. As I said, it's a very dense battlefield. Let's not forget that. It's
totally agree. And as a gunner who did 2 tours in Northern Ireland back in the 80s, there was no better training ground for Royal Artillery junior NCOs than Northern Ireland. Obviously, it's training and operations, but that gave us a level of infantry skills and training that we'd never have picked up anywhere else.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's. So I think what you're touching on is that by shutting it down to you can do this if you're in a Ranger regiment, and again, like you, I'm out. I don't know whether they go in, come out, I genuinely don't know, but you're sort of it's an exclusive policy, which before people just did this stuff. Now, I get it. They undoubtedly did not do in Zimbabwe as good a job as if you sent the Rangers in there or whatever. Now, I get that. But who are we helping here? The British Army or the task? I don't know. There's got to be a balance.
Abu Naji was an austere camp with limited facilities. It was also under sustained indirect fire from rockets and mortars. So even in camp, soldiers couldn't fully relax after being out in the ground. What measures did you take to maintain morale, discipline and cohesion with your unit during sustained combat operations, both on the ground and in a security base where allegedly you traditionally would get a bit of rest?
I'm very clear the single biggest factor for morale in Camp Abu Naji was this sort of Black Forest gateau cake that was served in the cookhouse, which I'm not kidding. We all joked that if they apart from ammunition, if you don't get this cake through, I have no idea what it was made of. It seemed to have no sell-by date, but it was ever present. But anyway,
the texture of sand as well.
Yeah, I know, and it was the most. I've never seen it before, never seen it since. Not sure I want to see it since, but it was ever present. I mean, I don't know how they got it up that road to us, but I'm glad they did. But it perhaps in more serious light, but maybe not. Maybe that sort of Black Foresty gateau cake was it. But I think one of the key factors for us could have been a sense of isolation and a sense of not knowing what's going on. So every night at around, I think it was at 7 p.m., I held an order O group, or in more civilian terms, a conference. Now, while in normal times, this would probably have only been attended by the company commanders and battle group staff. In the situation we had, that was not going to be optimum to make it an exclusive crowd. Because the battle group consisted of elements from, say, Queen's Royal Lancers, Royal Welsh Fusiliers, Argyll and Southern Highlanders, TA elements from the Lowlanders, individual reinforcements, of course, the Royal Artillery, Royal Engineers, REME, RMP, RAMC, absolutely, and other UK elements. I also had a US National Guard company operating in the area. Danish lifeguards came up at one time, and so a revolving cast of others. We also, of course, had Royal Air Force, air and ground crew. Look, so I thought it was a key that as many people as possible knew as much as possible, as often as possible. And why? So that we all worked as one, and also that we avoided blue on blue. And I don't just mean blue on blue in the traditional sense of kinetic blue on blue, but I mean in the way of our thinking. because you've already touched upon the fact that the rifle companies and the soldiers on the ground were doing the war fighting, but there was an awful lot on the background. There was politicking in order to get the war fighting to stop. And so unless I brought those together every 24 hours, nobody, left hand, right hand would not know what was due. So, as I say, I brought all the component elements in, and I did not care who attended. I said to the adjutant, it doesn't matter. I mean, literally, I don't care. Dog handler, master chef, and no joking, that is a key appointment. Because if the master chef doesn't know with a tempo of operations who's in, who's out, when they're in and where they're out, scoff's not getting made, and you know how important that is, and that is absolutely so. And anyone else that I could get in, and so we started with explaining the situation outside Maysan, across southern Iraq, across wider Iraq, because I say the whole thing kicked off even outside the UK area. In Basra, where regimentally we had a company with the Cheshire Regiment down there. Southern Iraq, we provided the Brigade Reserve, so they were harrying around the place. We had mates in that as well. And then in our area, what had happened in the past 24 hours, what we were looking to achieve in the next 24, and above all, why. The what was less important. The ops officer could tie up the details, but why we were trying to do something. And so what that meant was that, if I hadn't done that, rumors would have flown, truth would have been distorted, people wouldn't have known what was going on. And of course, that doesn't mean they wouldn't have talked about it. You would have had, everyone would have had an opinion. But most importantly, I think, it gave me a chance as the commanding officer to stand in front of the men and women under my command and to set a tone, to set a sense of confidence if necessary, to set a sense of urgency where it was required, to tone it down in some cases, and always try and set a sense of humour. But you don't need to do that. As you said, the British soldier will do that for you. Bash it. But it was also a good time for people to sit together with a cup of coffee and have a bit of, check balance on it. So, and do you remember that lieutenant in that dripping tent in Catterick for people to speak up?
Yeah.
And that happened too, because that was not just a lesson I identified, I learned it. So if you were the lieutenant in that briefing and you didn't understand, then I hope I created that space, and it did happen for people to speak up. And so I think, despite any bad times we sometimes faced, I hope it helped morale in that way, in that everyone had a sense of what was going on the bigger picture, what we were trying to do on the bigger picture, and why we were trying to do it. So,
I also remember your RSM had something similar for all the sort of the company and battery sergeant majors and that type of thing as well. So there was definitely that flow of information back and forward.
Yeah. Because as you know, if you don't do that, and it's not just the army, in any organisation I've worked for, their rumours will fly, but they won't appear as rumours. They'll appear as truth. What is the expression? A lie has gone twice around the world before the truth has got its boots on. And so you've got to put the truth out there. And it also comes down to, as a commanding officer or as regimental sergeant major, as senior NCOs, it comes down to trust. You've got to be truthful, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the indifferent. But in doing so, you build that trust, that they can trust that what they're hearing is true.
I find it interesting you mentioned the master chef there, because I used to watch those chefs in that heat preparing those meals. And I remember at one point the IDF got so bad that you had to introduce dispersed feeding around camp. I don't know if you remember that.
Correct.
And again, those chefs preparing all those containers and everything else. I think, we do. I'm glad you mentioned Master Chef, because I think sometimes we just forget that logistic support that is so important for morale.
Yeah, I mean, what is it? Montgomery said, any cowboy can command an armored division, it takes a genius to do the logistics, I think was his famous quote. And that's at sort of the operational, but at the tactical level, if you are not, food is so important. It's so important. Oh, obviously there's a physical element of the calorific intake and all that stuff, but it's that moment in the day where you can sit down, hopefully with your comrades, and just draw breath and eat some food and sort of reflect. And the chefs were brilliant. But not only were they brilliant at chefing, is because we were so strapped for manpower, they were then going in the sangers as well. I just literally cannot talk more highly about the chef and the catering team. They are so unsung. They are so in the background, so vital, and work so hard. They're great people.
So, a quick discussion now on something that has been in the news quite a bit now in various campaigns that British Army's taken part in, and again harks back to Northern Ireland. How did the complexity of the rules of engagement affect your decision making and your soldiers' ability to respond to threats?
Yeah, it's so we went into Iraq, and I described what we arrived in from the first battalion of the light infantry, and then our first afternoon. But we were on Northern Ireland, what was called yellow card rules of engagement. Now, that will be very familiar to you, be very familiar to many, many of your listeners. But for those who not, what that broadly means is you cannot engage a target unless your or someone else's life is in imminent danger, and you are clear in your own mind that by firing your weapon, it's the only option to prevent the loss of life. And so, given what I said about our first afternoon, why we're on those rules? Well, because again, it was a disconnect between the political and the strategic and reality on the ground. Because this was peace support operation, right? But no, the Mahdi army had not got that memo. But was it an issue on the ground? Well, no, actually it wasn't, because when you're in an ambush and an individual is emptying their magazine at you, or members of your patrol, then that legal use of force is covered. There is no other way to prevent further loss of life, in your opinion, than to fire your weapon. And equally in other circumstances. And actually, I just want to say that I saw restraint from the soldiers in firing their weapons. And I just want to give one example, if I can. No, you reminded me. We launched a large offensive operation, I think after the first 10 days, into Al Amara, out of our main base camp, to re-establish our rule, basically. And we went in at night, dawn came up, and there was a warrior down, looking down a road. I think it was crewed by the Black Watch, which again gives you an idea of the rolling cast we had up there. But I think it was a Black Watch, but I may be wrong. But now they were being fired at towards them by an individual with an RPG-7. And I heard this on the net. So I decided to go down and see what the score was. And I went down, and the crew sergeant, the Black Watch sergeant, I think it was Black Watch, he said to me, look, this individual, he pointed out, was firing at them. They'd taken a couple of rounds, I think one on the vehicle, one close to it, or two close to it. But they said, and he said, look, I think we're okay, but he keeps coming up the street in bounds. And if he gets too close, I am going to have to engage with him. Given the fact, though, that he was absolutely legally within his right to already have done so, he had restrained from doing so. So inevitably, this individual kept bounding up the street, door to door, side to side, and he was getting within an area that the crew might not have been concerned about, but I was getting increasingly concerned about. But what they did was, and this wasn't on my direction, they laid on the machine gun, the coaxial machine gun in the Warrior, on what was a wall where they reckoned this individual was next going to take cover behind. And as he came out of the one side of the street and ran towards this wall, they laid onto it. And as you know, that has a fairly sobering effect as the wall disintegrated in front of him. And he was almost cartoon-like. His eyes, he skidded to a halt, eyes came out on stalks. He dropped the rocket launcher and headed off back down the road at speed. A very sensible choice. So just say that because that was restraint. Even under the Northern, they were absolutely restrained. So it doesn't. We went in with Northern Ireland rules. It didn't really make a difference when you were firefighting, as you say, in intensive urban environments, and there was restraint. But it was a big issue of being under Northern Ireland rules was just the bureaucratic nonsense that came with it, which is that under the Northern Ireland protocols, every time a soldier fired their weapon, that was deemed to be a, quote, shooting incident, unquote, and that had to be fully investigated by the Royal Military Police. Now, as you know, many Green Army units go to Northern Ireland for 6 months or even 2 years tours, and no one would ever fire their weapon. So if a weapon was fired at all, it was a very, very big event. But it was later said about us that as a battle group, we'd fired more small arms ammunition than 7 Armour Brigade during the war phase. And it was also said that we were the most attacked regiment since the Korean War. I don't actually think they're particularly true, those. But it does give an idea of the intensity and the number of times that it was necessary, absolutely necessary, for weapons to be fired. And so there were soldiers who could be down to be interviewed by the Royal Military Police for literally dozens of shooting incidents. And at the same time, they need to be back on the ground, ironically, of course, probably adding to their shooting incidents, whilst also maintaining their weapons, maintaining their vehicles, getting some food and getting what little sleep they could. So I think, but I can't recall that the procedure changed by PGHQ during our tour. But the actual rules of engagement were probably less impactful than the bureaucracy of those rules trying to be enforced by the powers.
Which is interesting. I think that's a good rejoinder to some of the accusations being thrown around about British Army soldiers in general. The sort of the misconceptions about ruthless killers with no regard to life. And I think that's far from my experience.
Oh, yeah. And again, it goes back to this Northern Ireland idea. I mean, you and I sort of grew up in that judgment training. I mean, when I went through Sandhurst, so before we were even commissioned, we were sat down and taken through that judgment training that at what point can you fire your weapon? What point is lethal force the only option? If the gunman has fired his weapon and has killed the individual next to you, but drops their weapon and runs away, you cannot fire their weapon because they are not imminently, of a danger. Even if they fire that weapon and run away carrying it, you cannot shoot them because they are not imminently going to take a life. This was drilled into us. And that's, that is absolutely in our generation, in our DNA. And then, of course, as you know, you then went down onto the village, as it was in Northern Ireland training, and they deliberately set you up for that judgment training. And then there were sort of video ranges where they're absolutely aimed at judgment training. So judgment training about shooting, absolutely drilled into us, yeah.
Two of the most well-known engagements during the tour were at Simic House and the Battle of Danny Boy. And Danny Boy is a very complex subject, and we're going to cover that and the Al Schwery inquiry in a separate podcast. But can you just talk listeners through what happened at Simic House?
Yeah, so Simic House, as I said earlier, is a civil-military cooperation house. It was a house. It was a large house in its own compound, in the middle of the city of Alamara, so about, say, 7 kilometres away from the main base. It was deliberately picked and sensibly picked because it was next door to the seat of the provincial government. So it's a little bit like the house next door to the town hall. If you think of it that way, it was sort of a big house next door to the town hall. And therefore, it was an area where, or a location where, and that's why I was there that first afternoon, where the military commander, the politicians, and our policy advisor, the lady I said from the State Street who lived there, we could make that political activity work. During the tour, it was largely occupied by one PWRR support company, but the Royal Welsh Fusiliers did a fairly hot stint there during the summer too, and that must be recognised. So while it was an ideal location for its principal task, militarily it presented us with some problems. The River Tigris was between the main base and where it was. The city itself was between us and them. And interestingly, where it was located was on the junction of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And so it was very much the historical part of town, so narrow streets, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, because it was local to attack, it became the focus of the attacks by the Mahdi army. It was very heavily attacked by infantry, I would say up to platoon plus company minus strength, by mortars and rocket fire. And it was the single most attacked location throughout the tour. But getting it resupplied was at least, therefore, a company squadron operation. And by that, I mean warriors, challengers. We had top cover from a C-130 gunship to get us in and out, and to give a flavour of the fighting around the place. One night, I gave permission for a United States Air Force aircraft to drop a bomb off its wing onto a mortar crew that were hitting the base. And equally, I was loaned a UK Special Forces sniper team to go in there. It just happened at the time, the commanding officer of 22 SS was a very good friend of mine. We'd house shared at Staff College. He came down for a chat with me, which is good because he had the brain the size of Jupiter. We literally just kicked the door shut, got the bruise on, just the two of us. And he said, "Right, Matt, what's happening?" And he said, "Right, okay." And it was really good, actually. It was really good to bounce an idea off him. He was a superb individual. And then I can't remember whether it was 2 days later, a helicopter we'd never seen turned up, genuinely, and some reassuringly competent individuals with a Barrett 5.0 turned up. I mean, hey, look, most people say thanks for having me for lunch, in a thank you card. But obviously, if you're from Hereford, hey, have a couple of guys with Barrett. Actually, I think the individuals themselves were poor, but who cares? And they were extremely welcome. They're very helpful. But I think for me, it was the biggest single concern I had genuinely throughout the whole tour, was that they didn't have substantive medical facilities in that house. I could have put a doctor in there, could have put some medics in there, but none of the medical facilities that you really require for serious injury. And so we had this standing operation on call that if there was a serious casualty, we were going to have to fight our way in and fight our way out at company squadron level. Yeah, it was a hairy place to be. It was a hairy place to get into, and it was a hairy place to get out. And actually, half of Johnson Bahara's Victoria Cross was won on one of the resupply runs in there early on in the tour.
It's interesting you mention Johnson Bahari there, because the tour became well known for acts of gallantry. Well, actually, before I get onto that, the other thing it became well known for was that famous video that featured a lot of imagery from Simic House. And going back to your earlier comment about recruitment, I reckon that video must have led to an upsurge in British Army recruitment.
Right. I'm glad you think that, because let me tell you about that video, because I've got another side of that video. I've already said I don't get on well with generals, or I mistime my humour with generals, right? So, literally, the day that video came to light, and I can say this, it was cool. And of course, bear in mind, we're now talking about events that are 21 years ago. So those sort of, it was unique. It was new. It was novel. It was unique, and all that sort of thing. Anyway, anywho, that video came to my attention on the day that General Sir Mike Jackson, as the head of the army, was visiting, and visiting the battle group. Now, as any of you know, General Mike, he was an absolutely top bloke, and I don't know why I misinterpreted this, but anyway. Somebody said to me, hey, Colonel, you got this video. It's just come out. And I was like, right, hang on. I've got the brief. Quick, show it to me. I thought, blimey, I don't know, never seen one of these before, 21 years ago. I don't know. And then talk about, by the way, getting people to speak up. Sometimes they don't speak up with what you might think is the best idea. This voice said at the back of the tent as well, I think we should show this to CGS. And I thought, I'm pretty bloody certain we shouldn't actually. So anyway, I said no, let's not do that. Let's just crack on with the program. So anyway, we cracked on with the program, and he's fantastic as he always was. Anyway, he then went off to the helipad with his team, and in classic Mike Jackson thing, said, "Matt, don't you come out? You got other things to do. I'll get away." So he disappeared from battalion headquarters and walked up to the helipad, which is just some way away. And I don't know, I have a slight sense of relief that the visit had gone well, and but with Mike Jackson, he's a top bloke. And then I said, because we had a big screen in the battalion briefing room. I said, just stick that video back on. Oh yeah, all right, yeah. So they stuck the video on, and there was a company commander or whatever sitting there with a cup of tea and me. And Mike Jackson walks back in the door because the helicopter's been delayed, and he's just walked back in, and this video is running. And he stands there and goes, what's this? Oh, no. Anyway, it stops, and there's this pause. Genuine story. This went, that's really good, isn't it? That's really, play it again. So I thought, oh, right, okay. But I should have just played it in the first place. But that is an absolute true story about that video, which, it was it was cool, but it was, 21 years ago, people weren't doing that sort of social media stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It was groundbreaking for good or bad.
Yeah. But my timing with generals has obviously been off throughout my career.
So, as I said before, the tour became well known for acts of gallantry, and the awards illustrate the level of fighting. A VC, 2 conspicuous gallantry crosses, 2 DSOs, an MBE, 10 military crosses, 16 MIDs, a QCVS, and 14 Joint Commanders Commendations. And I know a lot of soldiers don't like talking about gallantry awards, but I think, what do these awards say about the character and performance of your soldiers under extreme pressure?
Well, as Winston Churchill, I think, said, quote, medals shine, but they also cast shadows, unquote. And I think there are 2 aspects to that truism from Winston Churchill. I think, first of all, any and every one of us who were honoured with our medals, we would give them back in a millisecond to have back with us the guys we lost, because that's the thing about the shine and the shadow. If they're going to be there shining, there's shadows cast by people who are killed, who are wounded physically and mentally. And I mean, that's the first thing I'd say is we'd give them back in a split second, I know, to have the guys back. And secondly, I while those who were honoured 100% absolutely deserved to be, I think all of us could name at least one, I know I can, or more individuals who, to our mind, deserve to be recognised. And again, as an example, I first made the announcement of the awards to 7 or 8 of the individuals you've listed. And I said to one of them, "You've been awarded the Military Cross." And without missing a beat, I'll never forget this. He said, "Yeah, but what about Corporal X and Private Weiser?" Didn't even draw breath. And that epitomizes the second point, which is that we can all name others. And the other thing is that you say people, soldiers don't like talking about it, and it's right. I went on and spoke to a senior NCO who got the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross, which is the award below the Victoria Cross. And he just looked at me, and not disrespectfully, but genuinely said, "Well, what for, sir?" I said, "Well," I read out his citation. I said, "Well, for rescuing under fire 2 soldiers from a burning armoured vehicle, re-entering that vehicle under fire, continuing to gauge the enemy, among a number of other things which were listed in the tour." He went, "Oh, yeah, okay, I suppose you put it that way, sir." So again, it's seeing their gallantry in context. Interestingly, just as a footnote to that story, their wives have been with my wife actually at a outside the room getting drinks or something. I put the tab on the Ministry of Defence. I really did. I said, "You can pay for this." But the wives came back in, and I said, "This is why you're here, and your husband's honours." Honestly, one of the senior NCO's wife started to cry, and she punched him. I mean, like proper punched him on the arm. I thought, okay, that's a bit of a strange reaction. And then through her tears, she said to me, he had explained to her on the phone throughout the 6 months that she wasn't to worry because he never left camp. He was just servicing the vehicles. And I thought, well, you deserve a second medal for talking your way out of that one. And I hope he paid large for a dress and a hat for a visit to Buckingham Palace. So yeah, it's nice to be recognised, and of course, as a commanding officer, but as a commanding officer, you have no idea what's going to be awarded. I mean, I know there's of interest to your listeners about how these things are arrived at in the process. But what happens is that what happened in our case is that even before the tour had ended, brigade headquarters said, "Oh, could you write up your award citations?" And of course, it's the army, so there's a form. It's called the Form Honours 770. I don't forget this, FHONS 770. And in Annex A of the Honours and Awards pamphlet, and you knew there was going to be a pamphlet, it says what criteria for what medal, but that doesn't actually matter at unit level, because all you do is you fill in the form, which I think is just a side of A4. The top bit is what you'd expect: number, rank, name, date, location, etc. And the bottom half, so it's only about an A5 side. I think it's got about a 500-word limit to it. You just write out the reason you're submitting this thing. You don't at unit level ever say what award you think it deserves at all. That there is a box for that, but it's left blank at your level. And obviously most of this heavy lifting was done by the company commanders, because again, the dispersed nature of the operation and the adjutant correcting their English. And actually, interestingly, and they then go up the chain of command through a process at brigade level, divisional level, and eventually permanent joint headquarters in the UK. And as I found out subsequently, in the case of a Victoria Cross or a George Cross, which are the same level of medal, a separate and unique committee sits at a very, very senior level to judge whether or not a Victoria Cross or a George Cross should be awarded. Because the criteria of getting a Victoria Cross, I think, are something like a 90% chance of death, and that's written down, which is why so many of them are posthumously, and so many of them getting them, people are severely wounded. And that process takes some time to work through, all of it. So for us, we sent in the paperwork. We finished the tour, took post-tour leave. completed an arms flop move, of course. You have to do that. Back out to Germany until about 6 months later, which was the following year, the awards were announced. And actually, of course, Johnson Harry's VC, quite rightly, but eye-catchingly caught the eye. Actually, we didn't even fill in that form well. What I mean by that is that I spoke to the brigade commander probably every night or every other night on the telephone. He was down in Basra. Top guy, parachute regiment brigade commander. So as you can imagine, very practical, very pragmatic, knew what he was on. And almost apologetically sort of said, Matt, where are your citations? I said, well, I can't, Brigadier, look, we've got a bit of a problem with this Private Bahari's one, who by that time, he was known to, because he'd severely wounded, evacuated to Q8 and down. I said, the adjutant, we just can't get in the 500-word limit because we don't know whether to go for situation A or situation B or a hybrid. And absolutely, because the parachute regiment brigadier said, Matt, you've got other things to get on with, and so is your adjutant. Just give us what you got, and I got staff down here who can put it together as to make it fit. And that was it.
Brilliant.
That was it. And 6 months later, we got the result. So, yeah.
That's fantastic. I'm always wary of hindsight and retrospectives, but I'm interested in your opinion on looking at the impact of FPV drones in Ukraine, and how do you think the battalion would have coped with this threat, and how would it have shaped your operations?
Well, we wouldn't have had, because there was no countermeasures, although equally the threat wasn't there. But I think in terms of general indirect fire, I would say that when we arrived in our base outside Alamara, there were smoke detectors, the normal smoke detectors in the offices, including mine, which may or may not have lost its battery early on. I cannot tell. There's a statute of limitations on those. I may or may not have been smoking heavily. I cannot tell. Moving on. But we had that sort of thing. But there was absolutely no warning system about incoming indirect fire, as you know.
Thanks for ruining my Easter leave, Matt.
Hey, look, all I can say is it was a great opportunity to have a fantastic beach holiday. A lot of sand, but the tide went a long way out. But so that's when you decided that you wanted to come up for some fun in the sun. So the first time we knew that we were under incoming mortar and rocket fire was when it actually went woomph. And funny enough, it did go bang once. I was actually on the phone to my wife. And I thought, and she said, what was that? I said, it's just someone's come in my office. They just shut the door rather heavily. I must go. I'll phone you later. Put the phone down and hid under the desk in a very inglorious manner. But anyway, so we had no warning at all. And then you guys came up, of course, and gave us that edge. But actually, I think what it really epitomized on a bigger scale is that how unprepared the army and the wider MOD were for what we had to face. You go on to war or you go on any operations with the kit you have on the shelf. And if that's inadequate, you're in a world of hurt. Yeah, as I said before, we deployed in stripped down Land Rovers with no protection, even against the weather. And we had, and this will stir some memory of something. We had Saxon, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers deployed in Saxon. Now, some of you may have vague recollections or no recollection of this vehicle. But it was brought into service 20 years before we went to Iraq. 20 years before. It was basically sort of an armoured truck, a lorry, if you remember. It was designed to move troops from the UK to West Germany when World War III broke out. And it was not designed. It wasn't designed as a frontline vehicle. It wasn't designed to protect against RPG-7s and IEDs. It was just against some shrapnel and blast from indirect fire. Yeah, we had those. We had those, stripped down Land Rovers, blah, blah, blah. So the point about drones, various sizes, is that if today you don't have those from day one, you're going to be in a very bad place indeed. But I'm sure the Army is well aware of that and on it.
Fingers crossed. I think I think we'll just leave that one and move on now to the legacy of TELIC format. What impact do you think the tour had on 1 PWRR as a regiment, and how did it shape the careers and outlook of those who served under your command?
I think to an extent I think to an extent, and I mean to an extent, so I don't want to be over arrogant about this. I think to an extent it might have put the regiment on the map, as it were. As I said before, the regiment formed in 1992, so only 12 years before these events. And when you form a new regiment, like any new thing, brand recognition is important, and brand recognition drops when you change your brand. Again, we've mentioned, this is not an issue for the Foot Guards. The Grenadier Guards have been in existence for 300 years, good brand recognition. Parachute Regiment, Royal Marines, been around since 16-something, so good brand recognition. We've only been in existence in this brand for 12 years. So I think in that way, I think it helped. Not that the PWRR have been idle at all since 1992. They've been Bosnia, Kosovo, etc. But it gave that impactful impression. I think it perhaps gave the regiment confidence. I certainly hope not arrogance. That actually, although it was new in its current format, and it, as you said in opening, it didn't have, like many county line regiments don't have, that media focus. It could perform on the biggest stage and perform well. And of course, it was to return to Iraq and into Afghanistan, where it added to its credentials, more military crosses won, etc., from TELIC 4 in all regards. And perhaps on a wider scale, it showed what was going to become the norm in similar, if not in very, very worse circumstances in the coming years in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is that line infantry delivering capabilities beyond which the perception of others. So we took over from the light infantry. We were supported by the Royal Welsh Fusiliers and the Argylls. We were followed the following summer in Maysan by the Staffords, all great regiments, as they were through TELIC and Herrick. And so I think it's sort of, I don't think that they doubted those regiments that they could do it, but I think it showed others that those could do it. Of course, just thinking about it, all those names have now disappeared from the British Army's Orbat. But the point is that if I don't think they doubted they could do it, but if anyone thought in any way that they couldn't do this at reach, high risk, dispersed, then hopefully we and others knocked that idea a little.
No, absolutely. And looking back 2 decades later, what lessons from that tour do you think remain most relevant today to military leaders? Sorry, I'll rephrase that. Looking back 2 decades later, what lessons from that tour do you think remain most relevant to today's military leaders and soldiers?
Well, I think you've got to be quite careful when you've retired to not, teach the current generation. But equally, I don't think we learned anything new. And I'm sure that, passing it on if they're interested to those who's serving now. They're old lessons, but the thing is, they are valid. And the first one is train hard at every level. Battle group staff, thinking fast, producing well-written coordination operation orders in time, well tied up, all the way down to the crews, the teams, the individuals knowing their drills, and do that under pressure. I think when Iraq and Afghanistan were ongoing and people were deservedly going forward to receive their gallantry awards, I thought it was nothing better in the media when you heard a soldier saying, the training kicked in. And that's why you do the training. The training is right, and it just builds that muscle memory. And when you get shot at and you get a stoppage, the training just kicks in. You just clear the stoppage, or you carry out the drills or whatever. But at the same time, I come back to again and again, train in an open culture. Be prepared at all levels, including the commanding officers, and perhaps especially the commanding officers, to have that feedback loop from below. Were those orders genuinely on time? Were they too detailed? Were they not detailed enough? Again, I remember in Iraq that we were going to do another run up into Simic House, and I've described those. And we tended to go the same way. And you and I both know the danger of setting patterns and so I decided that we would go another way. We'd pick another route in. And the squadron leader and the leading OC, along with the battle group chief of staff, came to me and they said that while obviously as commanding officer, all my ideas were of course brilliant, this one may be slightly less brilliant than the others. Because what they said that they appreciate my intent, but they felt that on balance, that the way they were going, and they were right, it was down a big, broad boulevard for a large area. It gave them better options for manoeuvre, better standoff, wider fields of fire, wider fields of observation. And so, could they go that way? Of course they can go that way. These guys doing the fighting. And they were leading it. So again, there you go, from that young Royal Regiment of Artillery lieutenant in Catterick in the 90s through to me being kind of, that's important. And the other thing I'd say is be flexible, which almost that's an example. I think Eisenhower said, the plan is nothing. The planning is everything. So you make your plan, you plan to execute it, but don't be dogmatic about it. Let your subordinates, and this means down to section level, section 2 IC level, run with the plan. If they've got the why, they'll work out the best way of doing the how. And I tell you, and you know this, tell everyone, you ain't going to be there on a dark night in a back alley when the rounds start firing. You can't be. So as long as they've got what they're trying to achieve, how they're going to do it, you just mentor that plan. But finally, and I think absolutely most importantly, it comes down to trust. The line of departure is not the time to start to gain the trust of anyone under your command. My first point, is almost my last point. You earn the trust and you build that trust every day. Soldiers will not crawl over your command and signals paragraph, if it still exists, in the orders and decide whether or not to follow you based on it. They go out the door on a dark night because they trust you as an officer, as a senior NCO. And they go out that door because, yes, you know your job, which you've proved on exercise, but moreover, because you've shown that you care for them, you know them as individuals, you've taken an interest in their careers, their families, their education, their personal issues, their housing, their courses, etc. So you actually, if you are as an officer, warrant officer, senior NCO are in barracks, what you're doing, apart from the evident military training, is your treatment and your care of your people is the most important thing you can do to earn that trust, which goes back to my start point. Leading soldiers is not a right. It's a privilege, and anyone of any rank earns that privilege through the gaining and building of trust.
Yeah, that's absolutely spot on, Matt. And you see that throughout history. Two of our most influential commanders in World War II, Slim and Montgomery, they epitomise at that high level of building trust and being visible to their soldiers, and that flowed down. Yeah. I also think it's interesting that throughout this conversation, the golden thread of decent training has been woven all the way through. And for me, two things I always remember, somebody said to me once, was you'll always default to your level of training. So if your training's not good, because you're not, when you're in a firefight, it's not a time to be learning. Well, you will learn lessons, but you want a decent standard before that happens.
Yeah, because the other thing is, in a continual operation like Northern Ireland or Iraq or Afghanistan, I tell you what, while you're on your 18-month or 2-year tour interval, the enemy ain't. The enemy are evolving. So if you walk back into any of those theatres of operation, having just relying only on what you did 2 years ago, it's a new rodeo out there. they've learned, and they're gonna hurt you.
So, as usual, we're going to be finishing off with Desert Island Dits, which is a guest choice of book, film, luxury item. So what have you picked, Matt?
Right. Book, first of all, is a book called Legionnaire by an individual called Simon Murray. This is the book I actually had on my bedside when I was commanding officer in Iraq, but I've read it so many times, and I have a number of versions of it, a number of editions, I should say. But it's also because there's, again, a story behind this. I was asked once what my favourite book was by a sort of gentleman, mate of mine, and I, as your listeners now know, I banged my gums, and I went on about how great this book was and why it's so great. And what I said was because this book is so good, because this is a story of a public school boy, late 1950s, for the loss of love of a woman called Jennifer. So it was a true story. He goes and joins the French Foreign Legion in the late 50s. Now, the French Foreign Legion is tough anyway, but in the late 50s, it was tough. A number of instructors obviously had been in former German armed forces and escaped into the Legion. So it was brutal. But the thing about the whole, and then Simon himself not only goes through the basic training, he then goes through into the parachute regiment element of the REP, the parachute French Foreign Legion, and actually in his 5 years makes a great success of it and actually becomes an NCO. And why the book attracts me is because it's not a misery memoir. I mean, it's not sort of, it's look how hard I am. We did this and we did that and we did this many press ups or this many. It's done in a very matter of fact way. And when you're reading it, you think, sorry, you read the sentence again. You did how far with what? And bear in mind the 50s and the kit and all that. And he's fighting in Algeria, and it's a brutal civil war. And at the same time, there's a coup by the army, including elements of the French Foreign Legion against de Gaulle. So there's a lot going on for this relatively young Englishman to deal with. But overall, over the whole tone of the book is this, I wouldn't say a sense of adventure, but a sense of, I knew what I was getting myself into. It's tough and it's a challenge, but he rises to it. Anyway, so it is my favourite book because it just gives a sense of perspective in tough times. Anyway, the fact is, I said this to this guy that asked me. I went on for even longer than your poor listeners have had to put up with. And without drawing a breath, he said, "Oh, that's lovely. I'm seeing Simon for lunch on Sunday. I'll let him know." Right, good. And then I actually met Simon Murray. Funnily enough, through him, I actually met the guy. Yeah.
It's, I remember I loved that book. My dad gave it to me when I was a kid, when I was probably a teenager.
Yeah.
And I always remember one thing. There's a bit in it where a crusty old senior NCO turns round to him and says, "The British, if they don't desert, either make the best legionnaires or the worst." And that just
correct.
just made me laugh.
Correct. Yeah. But if you've read it, you know what I mean. I mean, you get a lot of books now from a lot of people that served in the armed forces and foreign forces, and there's all an element of look how tough it was, look how tough I was, which is one narrative arc. But this is understated how tough it was, but actually this young man leaning into it, and yet it is tough. And I don't know, there's just this sense of adventure to it.
No, it's great. And he became an international businessman as well, didn't he?
He became incredibly successful. He became massively successful in that he then went on to be a very successful businessman in Hong Kong, Orange Network mobile phones in the early days, made quite rightly a lot of money and very, very successfully. There's a thing about the very reason that he left the Legion, to go to the Legion, but I won't spoil it for your listeners. Read the book.
Yeah, it's an absolutely brilliant book. And
yeah, it's a brilliant ending too.
Film choice?
Well, I'm going to go with A Bridge Too Far. Now, many will roll their eyes at that and say how cliched, but it's a great film. But for me, again, it's about personal thing. I had the massive, massive privilege in the early 90s of going to the battlefield tour of Arnhem, Market Garden, both the ground and the airborne element, when I was at the Army Command and Staff College at Camberley. And in those days, the veterans were still around. And one thing, we got to a riverbank, which you'll recognise, and there was a gentleman standing there, and I'll never forget it, in the most outrageous tartan golfing trousers, a ridiculously bright yellow wind cheater, and a clashing tartan cap, this American individual. But as he started to speak, we all realised Robert Redford paid you in the movie on the river crossing. He had been the commander who did the Hail Mary Full of Grace river crossing.
Yeah, and those crappy boats using rifles to propel themselves along.
And the other veterans that were there was, I sat next to, we turned up again, I think, 9 Megan, Guards Armoured. We were in a hotel car park, actually, and because you never knew who was going to talk to you, and I think they did it deliberately for that reason. And this very, very smartly dressed and smartly spoken elderly gentleman, you could tell he was a guards officer on a dark, foggy night from 400 metres away. I mean, yeah, they are right. Once you're the foot guards, you're always the foot guards. And he said, look, we were told to get up and capture the bridge at 9 Megan. So I turned around to Johnny and said, look, get your troop up there, take the end of the bridge. Johnny on foot went a couple of blocks, was shot, his tank was brewed up and he was killed. And then the sergeant passed through. More to it than that. Anyway, I found myself sitting next to this gentleman at dinner that night, and I said, "Did you know sort of Johnny quite well?" I think I'd like to think I was more subtle than that. And he said, "Oh yeah, he'd been in the regiment a couple of years. We'd been through D-Day together, obviously through the breakout D-Day, the Falaise Pocket, etc., etc." I said, "Oh," and he said, "Oh, you're probably wondering why I was sort of perhaps," and he was very, very good. He said, perhaps sort of dismissive of it. I said, "Well, He said, no, a couple of things you've got to realise." He said, we as a nation have been at war for nearly 5 years at this point. So our families have been bombed. We had brothers, uncles, cousins who were in the Navy, Air Force. I had a brother in Bomber Command. We'd lost them, or they were still fighting, or they were prisoners of war of the Germans or the Japanese. But it was a total war. And we ourselves have been through, obviously, the D-Day landings. And he said, I'll tell you, the breakout from Normandy was worse than Market Garden. And he said, far worse. And so where we used to operate it was a squadron would lead for a bound. Within that, a troop would lead for sort of semi-bound. And fundamentally, the end of that tour of duty, as it were, you were either dead, wounded, or survived, and you went to the back of the queue. So yeah, he said, I can see it sounds a bit callous, but no, I did know Johnny well, but it's just total war. And again, the film choice is really for that personal encounter, that opportunity of talking to those veterans, and that's why the film.
Yeah, amazing. I think those connections do mean so much, and at the age I am now, I remember talking to veterans when I first joined up in '85, and they were my age now, and the distance between the Second World War and when I joined is the same. And I just really wish I'd asked a few more inquisitive questions to these people when I had the opportunity. But, when you're young, you tend not to take advantage of these things. Well, I certainly didn't.
No, you're absolutely right. That 2 days of that battlefield tour was amazing. I mean, the other thing I remember was we were talking to a glider pilot, one of the stands, a glider pilot regiment sergeant, who was trapped in the thumb of the perimeter at Oosterbeek. He had been wounded twice. And of course, they tell this in such an offhand way, as though, but hadn't anyone, but probably had at that stage. He said, the Germans are coming up this road here, and showed us a sort of road, and he said, they're throwing grenades at us, we're throwing grenades at them, some of them we threw back at themselves, funny. But his takeaway point was, he said, but we saw the Royal Air Force coming in to drop our supplies, and yes, they were dropping them on the wrong drop zone. But do you know what I thought? If they can be bothered to come all the way here and risk their lives, then we can be bothered to hang on. And I just thought, it goes back to the you were talking earlier about gallantry. Why me? Why not X? What did I do? And again, the book Legionnaire and the veterans of Arnhem, it's that selflessness and it's that sense of perspective, which just takes your breath away, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And what would your luxury item be?
A decent single malt whiskey, please. I think whatever else, drink reasonably and responsibly. But at the end, you have to say these. But at the end of the day, a decent malt whiskey. And you know what? On occasions like this, a single malt whiskey, I always feel also in recounting one's past in the military, of course, you become so much braver with each sip, your enemies so much tougher, and the stories so much better.
As a caveat, though, Matt, I'll say there's been nothing but water and tea drunk on this podcast, so it's
absolutely for the benefit of the tape. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you're
so my initial opening of the podcast, I said that the early TELICs were sort of overshadowed by Afghanistan. And my book probably falls into that category as well. And my book choice is Dusty Warriors by Richard Holmes, a great historian with great ties to the battalion, actually. I think, was he honorary colonel at one point, Matt, I think?
He was the colonel of our regiment. Yeah.
It's an absolutely fantastic book. It tells you about that tour that the battalion did. But it's also so much more. It's quite personal about the people involved, what makes the battalion tick, all those things that make the battalion such a good battalion.
Mm.
But how did the book come about?
Well, Richard came out to visit us, and actually, he and I. You remember I said I came back, broke my R&R, came back, and then on the condition that I would continue it. So Richard came out to visit us, and I was going back to complete my R&R on the same flight as he. And obviously he had been, what he'd seen had made an enormous impression on him. Now, if you follow Richard Holmes, and everyone should read Richard's books, he had in the past written a book called Soldier Saab, which is about the British Army soldiers' experience in India during that time. He'd written Tommy, which is about the British Army soldiers' experience in the First World War and others. And he would very much felt that there was what he'd seen, this new modern post-Northern Ireland, pre-Afghanistan as it was, warfare needed to be, could be almost the third or fourth in that series. So he said, well, I think we should, I'd like to write a book about it. And I thought, okay. And he said to me, you've got to, but I want to capture the experience of your officers and men while it's raw. And I said, well, Richard, they're a tad busy at the moment to go all Jane Austen on me. And I'm not sure some of them are going to be that eloquent. And by the way, I obviously meant the officers there. Soldiers are being fine. But and he came up with a great idea. He said, well, look, what you do is, I suggest you do is, you remember blueies, that we had blueies in for those that don't understand, these are, those back in the day before the internet, or at the start of the internet, these fold up air mail letters. And as you know, they were given out by the bucket load for us to write home. He said, well, just go back and say, look, anyone, anonymously or not, just write on the bluey, because they're all over the place, or write on a piece of A4 or whatever. Anything. It can be why I was most scared, what was most funny, it doesn't matter. It literally about the combat, living conditions, that Black Forest freaking Cato. It literally just give me that. So I said, oh, okay, fine. And I genuinely didn't know whether, that would be well received. So after R&I went back to my, again, 7 every evening thing. And I said, look, guys, this is a score. Richard Holmes, and, even those not in the regiment very much knew him. And this is not about the PWRR necessarily. We want to get all, can you write, how about this and idea? And can you, more importantly, get the guys and girls down on the ground today and send them to the intelligence officer? And we were inundated. We were absolutely inundated and it was absolutely everything Richard wanted. The material he was after, which you can see in the book, it is the most, it's the most terrifying moment, very funny moment, moments, what life is like on duty, off duty, in those times. And my contribution was I came back, and he said, well, of course, I'll expect you to write something as the commanding officer's perspective. And I must admit, I literally didn't know where to start. But unfortunately, my mother-in-law had written a couple of books, and I was chatting with her. I said, look, I don't know how to do this. And she's unfortunately no longer with us, but she got me to a T. And she said, I know what you're doing. You're thinking like you do, and you're thinking the military. You're thinking you're going to start at the start and end at the end. I went, yes. She said, no, that's awful. What you do is you just start wherever you want to start, and then go left and right, front and back. And that's what I did. And actually that was my contribution, which was sort of woven between the thing to give them that. But yeah, it was good. It was good. But it was absolutely, it was a great thing for the guy, for folk to just write down anything. And that's how it came about.
Yeah, no, it's a really good book. And what comes obvious to it is Richard Holmes understands soldiers.
100%.
It's what you get from that.
100%.
And
he was an army reservist himself, went as a young officer and stuck with it all the way, as it were. So yes, he did understand soldiers. Yeah,
Matt, thank you for coming on the podcast. I've really enjoyed that chat, so much appreciated.
Pleasure. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome, mate. So that's it for another episode. As I said, thanks to Matt for coming on the podcast, and to you, the listener, for your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming, and our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. You can find all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you download us from iTunes and like the podcast, it'd be great if you could leave us a review there or anywhere you get your podcast from. And finally, thanks again to Nick Beale for his continuing help and offering technical support through his company ISAR. And we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.